G'day, this is Chris Savage from RL Ministries in Australia, welcoming you to this third and final session of the 8 Covenants of the Bible. I pray that it will be of benefit to you and help you in your Christian growth. Thank you for joining in. So last session we finished off the Mosaic Covenant with all its 613 laws. Mosaic law came to an end with the death of Christ. That law is no longer in force now. It was a conditional covenant between God and Israel, which was a case of, if God says, if you do this, then I will bless you. If you don't do this, then I'm going to curse you. So that was a conditional covenant. It's now come to an end with the death of Christ, and it's no longer in force. Tonight, we're looking at the last 3 covenants, and tonight we're going to look at the land covenant, and this is regarding the land that God promised Israel, and we find this in Deuteronomy 29 verse 1 to chapter 30 verse 20. The land covenant, for lack of a better name, this covenant is commonly called the Palestinian Covenant. Why? Because it largely concerns the land which has been known for centuries as Palestine. It's now pretty unfortunate title because of what the situation is in the Middle East at this time with the Arab-Israeli situation there. But it was given its name Palestine by a Roman emperor called Hadrian, and he, after the second Jewish revolt with Bar Kokhba back in 132 to 135 AD, he renamed the land from Israel to Palestine. Why? Because it was very similar to Philistine, and he wanted to simply de-Judaize the land of anything to do with Jews and Israel. In actual fact, it's a better title for this covenant would have been the Land Covenant, not the Palestinian Covenant, because Palestinian is not a biblical name anyway. Now, so we're going to refer to it as the Land Covenant. And so this is the same name which many people call the Palestinian Covenant, or you see that in many books anyway. Now, Deuteronomy 29 1 to 30 verse 20. So this is the covenant within the 5th book of Moses, Deuteronomy. And Deuteronomy 29 1 clearly shows that the land covenant is distinct from the Mosaic covenant. Deuteronomy 29 1. These are the words of the covenant which Jehovah commanded Moses to make with the children of Israel in the land of Moab, besides the covenant which he had made with them in Horeb. In Horeb, he made the Mosaic covenant with them. This is a different covenant. In Deuteronomy chapter 30, verses 1 to 10, he describes some of the provisions of the land covenant. It shall come to pass when all these things are come upon you, the blessing and the curse which I have set before you, and you shall call them to mind among all the nations whither Jehovah your God has driven you, and shall return unto Jehovah your God to all that I command you this day, you and your children, with all your heart, with all your soul, that then Jehovah your God will turn your captivity and have compassion upon you, and will return and gather you from all the peoples where Jehovah your God has scattered you. If any of your outcasts be in the uttermost parts of heaven, from thence will Jehovah your God gather you, and Jehovah your God will bring you into the land which your father possessed, and you shall possess it, and he will do you good, multiply you above your fathers. And Jehovah your God will circumcise your heart and the heart of your seed, to love Jehovah your God with all your heart, with all your soul, that you may live. And Jehovah your God will put all these curses upon your enemies and on them that hate you, that persecuted you, and you shall return and obey the voice of Jehovah, and do all his commandments which I command you this day. And Jehovah your God will make you plenteous in all the work of your hand, and the fruit of your body, the fruit of your cattle, and the fruit of your ground, for good. For Jehovah will again rejoice over you for good, as he rejoiced over your fathers, if you shall obey the voice of Jehovah your God, to keep his commandments, his statutes, which are written in this book. If you turn unto Jehovah your God with all your heart and with all your soul. So that's just the gives us some of the facets of the covenant. Who's it made between? It's made between God and Israel. The provisions of the covenant we see in 29 verse 2 to chapter 30 verse 1 of Deuteronomy. Israel will disobey the law of Moses, and the result of that will be scattering. They're going to be dispersed out of the land. Then in 30 verse 2, Israel is going to repent, turn back to God. In chapter 30 verse 3, the first part, Messiah will now return. And in chapter 3, second part of verse 3 and verse 4, Israel will be regathered again into the land. And then we're going to see in chapter 30 verse 5 that Israel is going to possess the land. Israel is going to be regenerated in verse 6. The enemies of Israel will be judged in verse 7. And then from verses 8 to 20, Israel is going to receive full blessings in the Messianic kingdom. So the land will be the whole land that God provided, God promised Abraham, will be theirs in the kingdom. What am I doing? Now, what's the importance of the covenant? The special importance of the land covenant is that it reaffirms the title deed to the land as belonging to Israel. It is Israel's land. Now, although she would prove unfaithful and disobedient, the right to the land will never, ever be taken away from her. It was an unconditional covenant that God made with her. It also shows that the conditional Mosaic covenant, which was last time, did not lay aside the unconditional Abrahamic covenant. Yeah, it might be taken by some that the Mosaic covenant displaced the Abrahamic covenant, but the land covenant shows that that's not true. Because remember, the seed of all these other covenants was found in the Abrahamic covenant. The land covenant is simply an enlargement of the original Abrahamic covenant. What happened then? Okay, so the land covenant is an enlargement of the original Abrahamic covenant. What it does is it amplifies the land aspect of the Abrahamic covenant, emphasizes the promise of the land to God's earthly Jewish people in spite of their unbelief. So the Abrahamic covenant teaches us that the ownership for the land, all that land that God promised Abraham, is unconditional, while the land covenant teaches that the enjoyment of the land is conditional upon obedience. Now, confirmation of the land covenant, we see in Ezekiel 16, verses 1 to 63. I'm not going to read it all. Now, the land covenant, we see it was received its confirmation in Ezekiel 16, 1 to 63. And this concerns God's relationship to Israel. God recounts his love of Israel in her infancy in verses 1 to 7. And later, Israel was chosen by God and became related to Jehovah by marriage. God married Israel, and hence she became the wife of Jehovah. And that's in verses, you find it in verses 8 to 14 of Ezekiel 16. What happened? Israel played the harlot, and she was guilty of spiritual adultery. How did she do that? Followed after idols. That's in verses 15 to 34. And so it was necessary then for God to punish her by means of dispersion. And that's exactly what happened in verses 35 to 52 of Ezekiel 16. Now, we know that this dispersion is not final, because there would be a future restoration on the basis of the land covenant. And we see that in 53 to 63. Now, even though they were guilty of violating the Mosaic covenant, which we see in 53 to 59, God will remember the covenant that he made with Israel in her youth. And we see that in verse 60 of Ezekiel 16. And he's going to establish an everlasting covenant, which is the new covenant, which we see in Ezekiel 16:60 as well. And this is going to result in what? in Israel's national salvation. Now, the status of this land covenant, it's still in effect today. It's an unconditional covenant, which means that it's not reliant upon Israel doing anything. It's a covenant that God made with Israel. God says, Israel, that's your land. Irrespective of what the world says today, that land is Israel's, and it will be owned by Israel in the kingdom. Now, after the land covenant, the second one after that would be the Davidic covenant. This has to do with King David. And we see this written up in 2 Samuel 7, verses 11 to 17, and 1 Chronicles 17, verses 10 to 15. Now, in the Davidic covenant, the emphasis is on Solomon, one of David's sons, in 2 Samuel 7 to 11, 2 Samuel chapter 7, verses 11 to 16 or 17. Now, moreover, Jehovah tells you that Jehovah will make you a house. When your days are fulfilled and you shall sleep with your fathers, he's talking to David, I will set up your seed after you that shall proceed out of your bowels, and I'll establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I'll be his father, he shall be my son. If he commit iniquity, I will chasten him with the rod of men and with the stripes of the children of men. But my loving kindness shall not depart from him, as I took it from Saul, whom I put away before you. And your house and your kingdom shall be made sure forever before you. Your throne shall be established forever. So he's talking about Solomon there. And now in the second account, we see in 1 Chronicles chapter 17, second part of verse 10 to 14, he's now talking about Messiah. Moreover, I tell you that Jehovah will build you a house, and it shall come to pass, when your days are fulfilled, that you must go to be with your fathers, that I will set up your seed after you, who shall be of your sons, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build me a house, and I will establish his throne forever. I'll be his father, he shall be my son, and I'll not take my loving kindness away from him as I took it from him that was before you, but I'll settle him in my house and in my kingdom forever, and his throne shall be established forever. Now, the participants in this Davidic covenant, it's made between God and David. David stands as the head of the Davidic house and dynasty, King David. And now he is the only rightful claimant to the Davidic throne in Jerusalem. The provisions of this covenant we see in the same passages. Now, if we look at both of these accounts, it brings out 7 provisions of the Davidic covenant. First of all, in 2 Samuel 7 verse 11 and 1 Chronicles 17 verse 10, David is promised an eternal dynasty. Nothing could ever destroy the house of David. The house of David will always be in existence. Although today it's unknown who they are, somewhere in the Jewish world are members of the house of David. They're still there. We just don't know who they are. Now, second, one of David's sons, specifically Solomon, was to be established on the throne after David. We see that in 2 Samuel 7 verse 12. If you read the story, you'll see that Absalom and Adonijah, 2 of David's other sons, tried to usurp the throne. But Solomon and Solomon alone was to be established on David's throne. And the third provision we see in this covenant would be that Solomon would be the one who would build the temple, and that's in 2 Samuel 7 verse 13. Now, David, he did have a desire to build God's temple, but problem with David was that his hands had shed too much blood, and he was guilty of murder at one point. So he was forbidden to build a temple, and the job would then rest with his son Solomon. Now, the fourth provision is that the throne of David's kingdom was to be established forever. And we see this in 2 Samuel 7, second part of verse 13, and also verse 16. It was not Solomon himself who was promised to be established forever, but rather it was the throne upon which Solomon would sit would be established forever. So, fifth thing, fifth provision, Solomon would be disciplined for disobedience, but God would not remove his loving kindness. We see that in verses 14 to 15 of 2 Samuel 7. Now, earlier, prior to Solomon, prior to David, God did remove his loving kindness from King Saul. Why? Because of Saul's disobedience. But the promise is made here that although Solomon may disobey and require God's discipline, God's loving kindness will never, ever depart from him. And the word loving kindness here emphasized it's a covenant loyalty. A covenant was made between God and David. Therefore, God's loving kindness would not be removed from Solomon. So Solomon, unfortunately, he did fall into idolatry. And that's the worst sin possible in Scripture. He did fall into that. The sin of Saul was not actually as great as Solomon's sin. Yet the kingdom was taken away from the house of Saul, but not from the house of David. So this shows the nature of an unconditional covenant. Solomon was under this unconditional covenant, but Saul was not. Now, the sixth provision we see is that the Messiah, he is going to come from the seed of David. And we see this in 1 Chronicles chapter 17, verse 11. The emphasis in 2 Samuel passage is on Solomon. But in the 1 Chronicles passage, it is on the Messiah. And in the 1 Chronicles passage, 1 Chronicles 7, God is not speaking of one of David's own sons to be established upon the throne forever. But it's going to be the seed of one of his sons coming many years later. And the seventh thing is that the Messiah and his throne, his house and kingdom will be established forever. And that's in 1 Chronicles 17, verse 12 to 15. So in this 1 Chronicles 7 passage, it is the person himself, that's Messiah, that is established upon David's throne forever, not simply the throne. And so the emphasis in this 1 Chronicles passage is not on Solomon, but it is on Messiah. And that's why this passage does not mention the possibility of sin, as we see in the 2 Samuel passage. Because in the case of Messiah, sin's going to be impossible. He just doesn't sin. Now, what we see is that the Messiah, as well as his throne, his house, and his kingdom are to be established forever. So, just if we sum it all up, the Davidic Covenant, God promised David 4 eternal things: an eternal house or dynasty, an eternal throne, an eternal kingdom, and an eternal descendant. And the eternality of the house, throne, and kingdom is guaranteed because the seed of David culminates in one who is himself eternal, and that is the Messianic God-man. Now, what's the importance of the Davidic Covenant? Well, the unique importance of this covenant is that, again, it amplifies the seed aspect of the Abrahamic covenant. Remember, I said that in the Abrahamic covenant, there's a seed of all these other covenants. According to the Abrahamic covenant, the Messiah was to be of the seed of Abraham. And this simply stated, what it stated here was that he was to be a Jew. So the Messianic person was to be a Jew, and he could be of any of the 12 tribes. But later in the time of Jacob, the seed aspect was now limited to a member of the tribe of Judah only. And we see that in Genesis 49, verse 10. So now the Messianic seed is further narrowed to one family within the tribe of Judah, and it is the family of David. So it's being narrowed down. So there's been we have this gradual narrowing of the seed. Remember, according to the Edenic Covenant, the Messiah must be of the seed of the woman, but this meant he could have come from any part of humanity. According to the Abrahamic Covenant, he had to come out of Jewish humanity, which meant he could come out of any tribe of Israel. But with the confirmation of this covenant through Jacob's 12 sons, he now had to come out of the tribe of Judah. But again, it could be from any family of the tribe of Judah. But now with the Davidic Covenant, Messiah has to come from the seed of David. And it's going to be narrowed even one step further down in Jeremiah chapter 22, verse 24 to 30. It shows that Messiah has to come from the house of David apart from Jeconiah. God pronounced a curse upon Jeconiah that he would not have any of his seed sitting upon the throne. So can't come from Jeconiah. Confirmation of the covenant we see in a number of passages. You see 2 Samuel 23, 1-5, Psalm 89, 1-52, Isaiah 9, 6-7, Jeremiah 23, 5-6, and a few more. Now, in 2 Samuel 23, 1-5, we see here that God made an everlasting covenant with David. So this is just confirmation. Also, Psalm 89, 1-52, in verses 3 and 4 and 34-37. In verse 3 of Psalm 89, God made a covenant with David. Verse 4, David's seed and throne will be established forever. So this is written up in Psalm 89. And then in verses 34-37, the covenant is going to last as long as the sun and the moon. In Isaiah 9, verses 6-7, we see in verse 6 the messianic person. In verse 7, we see the messianic rule from the throne of David. And then in Isaiah chapter 11, verse 1, we see that Messiah is the stock of Jesse. Jesse was David's father. And then in Jeremiah 23, 5-6, in verse 5, we see that messianic rule, he is the righteous branch of David. And in verse 6 of Jeremiah 23, we see the messianic person himself. In Jeremiah 30, verse 8-9, David is to co-rule in the messianic kingdom. Who's he going to co-rule with? He's going to co-rule with Jesus, Messiah. He'll be the king. Jeremiah 33, 14-17 and 19-26. In Jeremiah 33, 14-16, we see the messianic rule. In verse 17, we see that David will never want a man to rule on his throne. 19-21, we see the Davidic covenant is going to last as long as there is an interchange of day and night, which means a very long time. And in Jeremiah 33, 14-17, we see that David's seed, in verse 22, we see that David's seed will be multiplied. In 23-25 of Jeremiah 33, the covenant cannot be rendered null and void. And then in 26, a member of the seed of David will always rule. There's some other confirmations we see. We see David is going to co-rule in the kingdom. Remember, Jesus will be the messianic king over the ruling of the whole world, but David is going to co-rule in the kingdom, and we see that in Ezekiel 37, 24-25. We also see David will co-rule in the kingdom in Hosea chapter 3, verses 4-5. And also we're going to see that the tabernacle of David will be rebuilt in the kingdom in Amos chapter 9, verse 11. Now, in the New Testament, in Luke chapter 1, verse 30-35, what do we see there? We see in verse 32, the eternal throne. In verse 33, the eternal house. In verse 33, again, the eternal kingdom. And then in verse 35 and 32a, we see the eternal descendants. So Luke writes about this as well. Now, some final confirmations about this. First of all, the Messiah of the house of David is about to come. And we see that in Luke chapter 1, verse 68-70. And again, we see the tabernacle of David is going to be rebuilt. And we see that in Acts 15, 14-18, the tabernacle, the house of David. Now, the status of the Davidic Covenant, well, remember, it's an unconditional covenant, and it is still unfulfilled to this day, and it is still very much in effect. It's an eternal covenant. Now we come to the new covenant, which is where we are today as Gentiles. The new covenant, we find that in Jeremiah chapter 31, verses 31 to 34. Now, several passages speak of or relate to, well, more than several, a number of passages speak of the new covenant, and many of these will touch on as we go through. Foundational passage of the new covenant is Jeremiah chapter 31, verse 31 to 34. And Jeremiah writes, "Behold, the days come, says Jehovah, that I'll make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah, not according to the covenant that I made with their fathers in the day that I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt, which my covenant they broke, although I was a husband unto them." That was the Mosaic covenant. "But this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, says Jehovah. I will put my law in their inward parts, and in their heart I write it. And I will be their God, and they shall be my people, and they shall teach no more every man his neighbor, and every man his neighbor, and every man his brother, saying, Know Jehovah, for they shall all know me, from the least of them unto the greatest of them, says Jehovah. For I'll forgive their iniquity, and their sin will I remember no more." So that is the new covenant. Now, participants in this covenant, it's made between God and Israel, because for Israel, this is a replacement of the Mosaic covenant, which is no longer in effect, and it receives further confirmation in other passages, which we see also in Isaiah 55:3, Isaiah 59:21, Isaiah 61:8-9, Jeremiah 32:40, and Ezekiel 16, which we spoke about before. Also in Romans 11:26-27 as well. Now, provisions of this covenant. Now, from the original covenant, with its confirmations and its inauguration in the New Testament, a total of 9 provisions we can find. First of all, we see here that it is an unconditional covenant involving God and both houses of Israel. It was not made simply between Judah and God or between Israel and God, but it included both houses of Israel. So it includes the entire Jewish nation. Remember, Israel split into the northern and southern kingdom, Israel up north, Judah down south, after the death of Solomon, and when his son Rehoboam increased taxes on the northern kingdom, they said, we're out of here. So it split them. So what we see is, so here God made the covenant with both houses, with Judah, southern kingdom, Israel, northern kingdom. And so it means it covers all the Jews everywhere. Covers the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So notice nowhere here does it say the church, okay? It is not made with the church. Something else. The second thing about this covenant is that it is clearly distinct from the Mosaic covenant. We see this in verse 32 of chapter 31. It's not a elaboration of the Mosaic covenant. It is totally separate from it. It's to replace the Mosaic covenant that was now considered broken. And the third provision we see is that it promises the regeneration of Israel. And we see that in verse 33 of Jeremiah 31. Also, we see it in Isaiah 59, verse 21. Now, the key aspect of this new covenant is the blessing of salvation, which includes Israel's national regeneration. They're all going to believe. And the fourth thing we see is the regeneration of Israel is to be universal among all Jews. We see this in verse 34 and in Isaiah 61, verse 9. So the national salvation of Israel is extended to every individual Jewish person, and it is to be true through succeeding generations from the time that the initial regeneration of Israel occurs. What does that mean? It means that once those Jews who enter into the kingdom, once they are born again, regenerated, every Jew after that will be regenerated. None can be lost. So during the kingdom, the only unregenerate people will all be Gentiles. In the entire period of the kingdom, there'll be no unsaved Jews. Every Jew will be saved. And that's the reason that there'll be no need for one Jew to say to another, know the Lord, because they're all going to know the Lord. But with Gentiles, they have a time frame to which they need to come to believe, and that is up until the 100 years, and after that, if they haven't believed, they're gone. Now, fifth provision we see here is the provision of forgiveness of sin in verse 34. So the new covenant will do the very thing that the Mosaic covenant was unable to do. Mosaic covenant was able only to cover the sins of Israel. The blood of animals could not take away sins. It only covered the sins. But the new covenant will take them away. So this is a corollary blessing to the blessing of salvation. So all their sins taken away. The sixth thing we see here is that there is now going to be the indwelling Holy Spirit, and that's in verse 33 of Jeremiah 31. Also see that in Ezekiel 36, verse 27. So what we know is that the reason Israel failed to keep the law under the Mosaic covenant was that the people lacked the power to comply with the righteous standards of God. Mosaic law did not provide the indwelling of the Holy Spirit. That was not its purpose. But the new covenant will do just that. And every Jew will be enabled to do the righteous work of God. And so this is a blessing resulting from the blessing of salvation. The moment anyone believes, indwelt by the Spirit instantaneously, and that the Holy Spirit then gives them the ability to conform correctly to the standards of God. And the seventh thing that we see is Israel are now going to be showered with material blessings. We see that in Jeremiah 32, verse 41. We see it in Isaiah 61, verse 8, and Ezekiel chapter 34, 25 to 27. Mosaic law did provide material blessings for obedience, but unfortunately, for the most part, Israel was in disobedience. Why? Because of her failure to keep the law. But in the new covenant, such failure is not going to exist. And along with Israel's regeneration and the indwelling Spirit empowering her to keep the law, material blessings will be given by the Lord. And the eighth thing we're going to see is that the sanctuary will be rebuilt. And we can find that in Ezekiel 37, verses 26 to 28. Now, Mosaic covenant provided for the building of the tabernacle. That's what Moses had. Davidic covenant provided for the building of the first temple by Solomon. Now, the new covenant is going to provide for the building of the messianic or millennial temple. And this temple will be a continual reminder to Israel of all that God has done. So that's going to be built by Messiah. And just as the ninth thing is that just as the Mosaic covenant contained the law of Moses, the new covenant contains the law of Messiah. And we see this in Romans chapter 8, verse 2, and Galatians 6, verse 2. It's called the law of the Spirit of life in Romans 8:2, and it's called the law of Messiah in Galatians 6:2. Now, Mosaic law had 613 commandments, yes. Law of Messiah also contains many individual commandments that are applicable to the New Testament believer. And these commandments were given either by Jesus directly or by the apostles. Now, a simple little comparison here simply shows us that it cannot be the same as the Mosaic law. First of all, four things which we just look at here. 4 observations. First of all, many commandments are the same as those of the law of Moses. For example, of the 10 commandments written on tablets of stone, 9 of them are in the law of Messiah. But there are also differences. Many are different from the law of Moses. For instance, in the law of Messiah, there is no Sabbath law. The nine written on the tablets, Sabbath law was missing. There's no Sabbath law, and also, and we see that in Romans chapter 14 verse 5 and Colossians chapter 2 verse 16. You can keep whichever day you want. And there's also no dietary code. You want to eat bacon and eggs, you eat bacon. You want to eat lobster, you eat lobster. And we see this in Mark chapter 7 verse 19 and Romans chapter 14 verse 20. So we have differences, and we have some the same, and we also have some pretty stark differences. Now, something else. Some commandments in the law of Moses are now intensified by the law of Messiah. For example, law of Moses said, love your neighbor as yourself. And we see that in Leviticus 19 verse 80. Now, this made man the standard. Love your neighbor like you love yourself, right? But the law of Messiah is different. The law of Messiah now intensifies it, because the law of Messiah said, love one another even as I have loved you. And we see that in John chapter 15 verse 12. Now, this makes Messiah the standard. And how much did he love us? He loved us enough to die for us. Fourth comparison here, the law of Messiah now provides a new motivation. For example, the law of Moses was based on the conditional Mosaic covenant. And so the motivation in the Mosaic law was, do this in order to be blessed. Now, the law of Messiah is different. The law of Messiah is based on the unconditional new covenant. And so motivation is, you have been and are blessed, therefore do this. The doing comes out of thanksgiving for the blessing already received. Mosaic law was, if you do this, then I will bless you. Not so in the law of Messiah. So the reason that we have so much confusion over the relationship of the law of Moses and the law of Messiah is that many of the commandments are similar to those found in the Mosaic law. And then what happens is, well, people just say, oh, well, obviously certain sections of the Mosaic law have been retained. But we saw in the last session on the Mosaic law that it is a unit. It is one block of laws. All 613, you can't separate them out. So what we saw there is that you cannot just take the moral laws out and say, well, these are still in force. No, not at all. Not at all. Now, we can best understand this if we realize that there are a number of codes in the Bible, such as we have the Edenic code, the Adamic code, Noahic code, Mosaic code, and a new kingdom code. Now, what this means is that a new code of law, a new code may contain some of the same commandments of the previous code, but this does not mean that the previous code is still in effect. So while certain of the commandments of the Adamic code, for instance, were also found in the Edenic code, it did not mean that the Edenic code was still partially in force. Edenic code ceased to function with the fall of man. That law code was finished. The same is true when we compare the law of the Messiah with the law of Moses. There are many similar commandments. For example, 9 of the 10 commandments are to be found in the law of Messiah, but this does not mean that the law of Moses is still in force. The law of Moses has been rendered inoperative, and we are now under the law of the Messiah. And there are many different commandments. For example, under the law of Moses, we would not be permitted to eat bacon or roast pork. Under the law of Messiah, we can. So there are lots of similar commandments, but they're nonetheless in 2 separate systems. Now, if we do not kill or steal today, it is not because of the Mosaic law, right? But it is because of the law of Messiah. On the other hand, if someone steals, he's not guilty of breaking the law of Moses. He's guilty of breaking the law of Messiah. So our present obligation is to obey the law of the Messiah because we're under the new covenant, under the new covenant system. We see in Isaiah 53 the confirmation of the covenant. It's in Isaiah 55 verse 3. It's an everlasting covenant is made with Israel, everlasting. The covenant will result in Israel receiving the Holy Spirit. We see that in Isaiah 59:21. An everlasting is made with Israel, and the everlasting covenant is made with Israel, and they're going to be known as the seed of Jehovah. And we see that in Isaiah 61 verses 8 to 9. Everlasting covenant will result in Israel's national salvation. Jeremiah 32:40. Everlasting covenant we see in Ezekiel 16 verse 60. Covenant of peace resulting in material prosperity we see in Ezekiel 34 verse 25 to 31. So these are all confirmations of this new covenant, this new everlasting covenant. In Ezekiel 37 26 to 28, it says, I'll make a covenant of peace with them. So this covenant of peace is going to result in material prosperity. In verse 27, it says, my tabernacle shall also be with them, and I'll be their God. So God's tabernacle will be with Israel. His dwelling will be with Israel. Also in verse 28, it says, the nations shall know that I am Jehovah that sanctifieth Israel. So Israel is going to be sanctified. And these are all in the new covenant. Now, what's the importance of the covenant? Well, it simply is that it amplifies the blessing aspect of the Abrahamic covenant, especially in relation to salvation. And it also shows how the spiritual blessings of the Jewish covenants actually extend to the Gentiles. In relationship to the church, now, this is where we have some confusion as to the relationship of the church to the new covenant. Remember, Jeremiah said that this covenant is made with both houses, the house of Israel, the house of Judah, not the church. But a number of scriptures do connect the new covenant with the church. And we see those in Matthew 26:28 and places like Mark 14:24, Luke 22:14 to 20, 1 Corinthians 11:25, 2 Corinthians 3:6, and a host of others in Hebrews, the book of Hebrews. Now, the most popular solution in church history has been the theology of replacement or transference, which teaches that the church has now replaced Israel in its covenantal standing with God. So what they're saying is, well, God is finished with Israel, therefore the church has now replaced Israel because the church had believed in Messiah. So what covenant theology or replacement theology or transference says is that the covenant promises are now being fulfilled in, by, and through the church. So it's obvious that they're not being fulfilled literally, and so they teach that the intent was for them to be fulfilled spiritually. That is covenant theology. The problem, though, is that it requires an allegorical interpretation of the covenants, and it then requires you to ignore all the details, such as the land promises. Abraham was told to walk the whole length and breadth of the land, for he will someday inherit it. We see that in Genesis 13, 14 to 17. So this replacement theology view has been rightly rejected by those who accept a literal approach to the covenants. And what they have done now is they've offered two other solutions. And some writers teach that there are now two new covenants, one made with the church and one made with Israel, except that you can't find it anywhere in the scriptures. There's no indication that there are two covenants with the same name. If you mention a new covenant to a Jew, they'd automatically think of Jeremiah 31. And there are some verses used of the new covenant for the church, but those verses still cite Jeremiah 31. The second thing that they propose is that there is only one covenant, but it has two aspects, one related to Israel, one related to the church. Again, there's nothing we see that teaches that there are two completely different aspects to the new covenant. And even those who hold to this view, they can't exactly tell you which aspects relates to the church and which relates to Israel. Usually they say, the blessing aspects relate to the church and the cursing aspects relate to Israel. But if you adhere to the scriptures, it's not difficult to work out, because it's clearly explained in two passages. And this is the proper view, which would be the partaker view. First passage we look at is Ephesians 2, 11 to 16. Wherefore remember that once you, the Gentiles in the flesh, were called uncircumcision by that which is called circumcision in the flesh, made by hands, that you were at that time separate from Christ, alienated from the commonwealth of Israel, and strangers from the covenants of the promise, having no hope and without God in the world. But now in Christ Jesus, you that once were far off are made nigh in the blood of Christ. For he is our peace, who made both one and broke down the middle wall of partition, having abolished in his flesh the enmity, even the law of commandments contained in ordinances, that he might create in himself of the two one new man, so making peace, and might reconcile them both in one body unto God through the cross, having slain the enmity thereby. That's Ephesians 2, 11 to 16. Ephesians 3, 5 to 6 says something very similar, which in other generations was not made known unto the sons of men, as it has now been revealed unto his holy apostles and prophets in the Spirit. To wit, the Gentiles are fellow heirs and fellow members of the body and fellow partakers of the promise in Christ Jesus through the gospel. The physical blessings belong to Israel. The church has now become a partaker, not a taker over, a partaker of the spiritual blessings of the Jewish covenants. How? Because the middle wall of petition was removed by the death of Christ. Middle wall of petition. Now, the point of these passages here is that God made 4 unconditional covenants with Israel: Abrahamic covenant, the land covenant, the Davidic covenant, and the new covenant. Now, all of God's blessings, both physical and spiritual, are mediated by means of these 4 unconditional covenants. But there's a 5th covenant, which was a conditional Mosaic covenant. This was the middle wall of petition. And what that was there for, it was there to keep the Gentiles from enjoying the spiritual blessings of the four unconditional covenants. For a Gentile to begin receiving the blessings of the unconditional covenants, he had to totally submit himself to the Mosaic law. He had to undergo circumcision, and he then had to take upon himself the obligations of the law. And for all practical purposes, he would live as a son of Abraham, he would live as a Jew. Gentiles as Gentiles were not able to enjoy the spiritual blessings of the Jewish covenants. That's why it says that they were strangers from the commonwealth of Israel. They did not receive any of the spiritual benefits contained in the four unconditional covenants. However, when Messiah died, the Mosaic law, the middle wall of petition, was now broken down. Now, by faith, Gentiles as Gentiles can enjoy the spiritual blessings of the four unconditional covenants. That's why Gentiles today are partakers of Jewish spiritual blessings, not taker-overs. Romans 11:17, similar concept. Romans 11:17, if some, this is the olive tree, but if some of the branches were broken off, and you, being a wild olive, were grafted in among them, and did become partaker with them of the root of the fatness of the olive tree. Now, the olive tree represents the place of spiritual blessings of the Jewish covenants. The types of branches partaking of the blessings, we have the natural branches, which are the Jewish believers, and then we have the wild olive branches, which are the Gentile believers. But the olive tree itself, it still belongs to Israel. In verse 24 of Romans 11. For if you were cut out of that which is by nature a wild olive tree, that's you Gentiles, and were grafted contrary to nature into a good olive tree, how much more shall these, which are the natural branches, be grafted into their own olive tree? So the olive tree still belongs to Israel, and these are Jewish spiritual blessings coming out of Jewish covenants. There is only one covenant. It's not two, it's not split into two. And this covenant, which is a new covenant, and this covenant was made with Israel. And the relationship of the church to the new covenant is the same as the church's relationship to the Abrahamic covenant, the land covenant, and the Davidic covenant. The physical promises of the Abrahamic covenant, as we see amplified by the land and Davidic covenants, were promised exclusively to Israel. However, the blessing aspect, as amplified in the new covenant, was to include the Gentiles. And so the church today is enjoying the spirit, the church made up of Gentiles, mainly Gentiles and Jews, is enjoying the spiritual blessings of these covenants, not the material and physical benefits. Physical promises still belong and will be fulfilled exclusively with Israel, especially those involving the land. But all spiritual benefits are now being shared by the church. And this is the church's relationship to these four unconditional covenants between God and Israel. Abrahamic covenant in Genesis 12:13 already promised that there would be spiritual blessings would extend to the Gentiles. Now, main points, just some points here. The blood of the Messiah is the basis of salvation in the new covenant, and this is what was shed at the cross. The blood of the Messiah ratified, signed, and sealed the new covenant, and you can find that in Hebrews 8:1-10, verse 18. The provisions of the new covenant cannot be fulfilled in, by, or through the church, but have to be filled in, by, and through Israel. The church are simply partakers It cannot be filled. The covenant, the provisions of the covenant cannot be filled by the church. The church are partakers of the spiritual blessings. It's true that the covenant is not now being fulfilled with Israel. But remember, this does not mean that it is therefore being fulfilled with the church. Remember that not all provisions go into effect immediately. The church is related to the new covenant only insofar as receiving the spiritual benefits of the covenant, such as salvation, but the church is not fulfilling it. The church has become a partaker of Jewish blessings, spiritual blessings. The church is not a taker over of the Jewish covenants. It partakes of the spiritual blessings and promises, not the material or physical blessings. So what's the Gentiles' obligation? We see this in Romans 15, 25 to 27. The fact that Gentile believers have now become partakers of Jewish spiritual blessings places an obligation on them according to Romans 15, 25 to 27. Paul writes here, he says, "But now I say, I go unto Jerusalem, ministering unto the saints, for it has been the good pleasure of Macedonia and Achaia to make a certain contribution for the poor among the saints that are at Jerusalem. Yes, it has been their good pleasure, and their debtors they are. For if the Gentiles have been made partakers of their spiritual things, they owe it to them to minister unto them in carnal things." So as Paul was coming close to ending his letter to the Romans, he spelled out his immediate plans. And he says in verse 25, he says, I couldn't come to you immediately. Why? Because I wanted to come for a long time, but I had a duty to do, which was to collect an offering and take it to the Jewish believers in Jerusalem. And this special offering is, we see it in 1 Corinthians 16, 1 to 4, and 2 Corinthians 8 to 9. In verse 26 of Romans 15, Paul named the contributors and the recipients. Was Macedonia and Achaia. They were the contributors, and they were the Gentile believers, and the recipients were the poor Jewish believers in Jerusalem. In verse 27, Paul taught Gentile indebtedness to the Jews. And he clearly stated here that Gentiles are debtors to the Jews, and then gave the reason for this. Why? Because Gentiles have become fellow partakers of Jewish spiritual blessings. Now, earlier on in Romans 11, Paul taught that the Gentiles have become partakers of spiritual blessings. But these are Jewish spiritual blessings that are mediated through the Jewish covenants. And the very fact that Gentiles have been made partakers of Jewish spiritual blessings has put them into debt to the Jews. And according to this verse, the way they pay their indebtedness to Jewish believers is to minister to them in material things. The status of this covenant, well, in relationship to the church then, the new covenant is the basis of the dispensation of grace. In relationship to Israel, the new covenant is the basis for the dispensation of the kingdom. The new covenant itself is an unconditional covenant, currently unfulfilled, and therefore eternally in effect. And that's the end of the covenants. Here's the contact details there if you need to contact us.